Good morning and very warm welcome to our wonderful Family and Children's Day. I'm Fiona Stanley, who's Director of the Festival of Ideas, and in a way this is Liz Waters and our special day. And so we're very excited about the kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about today. The whole aim of this festival, and those of you who've been here before heard me say this, is to actually challenge. It's actually not to make you feel comfortable. It's actually to make you feel as though you can do something to change what we might consider to be the parlour state of certain things that are happening in our society. And actually, at the end of this festival, to have a series of propositions, manifestos, and discussion documents that we can then go on and start debating and using to make a difference to our society. And it's come through from every session up till now that people power is actually possibly a very strong way to do things. And so today I think will be no different. We've got this wonderful session this morning with some outstanding speakers about how is our culture in our modern society affecting our ability to be good parents and to have healthier children who are going to have well-being. We then go on to one of my favourite hobby horses, which is the medicalisation of normality. And Ray Moynihan will be creating a disease with you, the audience, and selling it. And then we go into an afternoon, which Dorothy Scott has helped us develop, about not just about children's rights, but their responsibilities and children participating in our society and making a difference. So for today, it's going to be great. We're incredibly lucky to have Kathy Lett here, who gave a terrific talk last night at the Women's Centre and is going to be at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre tonight talking about asparagus syndrome, which was the name her Asperger's son gave to his condition. We have had some very funny comments from some of the autistic people saying, we're not vegetables. But that's right, the majority of tweets and emails were very positive about it, Kathy. But so the whole thing is about participating, getting your ideas in. Everyone needs to tweet and ask questions. I'm extremely grateful to Adrian Collette, who stepped in at the last minute because our chair, Bryce Ives, has phoned in sick. So, Adrian, thanks to you, and thank you all for coming. It'll be a great day.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and a very, very warm welcome to you all. In welcoming you, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Yes, I wasn't supposed to be, well, I was going to be here as an audience member today, looking forward to this session a great deal. But here I am with 10 minutes notice as your chair, so you'll forgive any road bumps that we hit, but I'm sure it'll be a really fascinating and interesting session. Just some notices to begin with. Upstairs, you've probably noticed our Bunjil's nest now taking shape. I see a few familiar faces here already from the last couple of days. Please, as you go upstairs, make a contribution to the Bunjil's nest as it develops through the life of this festival. As Fiona said, this is as inclusive. Everyone has a voice at this festival, so feel free to have your mobile phones on silent would be preferable. And Twitter, the hashtag you can use to Twitter and contribute to this session is UOMFOI, University of Melbourne, Festival of Ideas, he said, quick as a flash. That's the hashtag to use to contribute your ideas and opinions live to this session. And this will be moderated for us by Rashada Kasim. Rashada is just here. Rashada is a member of the Melbourne University Debating Society. I'm afraid to say that not all Twitters are created equal, so Rashada will be curating or moderating them, and from time to time she will also make sure that your opinions join the debate this morning. There's also, at the end of the session, the chance to poll. We actually poll live, both here and from people listening to the discussion through live streaming, to see which of the propositions put up by our speakers capture your imagination most. I'm going to read the abstract before introducing our speakers, because I think it is a very fine and potent thing to be thinking about in our changing world in our first session. And it reads, As our world continues to rapidly change, so too does our understanding of family. Single-sex families, the divorce rate, blended families, and the increasing role of childcare services providers and extended families in the upbringing of children bring with them many new challenges. Do families become more or less functional outside the traditional nuclear model? Does an insecure economic outlook cause us to neglect our relationships in the drive to earn a secure future for ourselves and those we love? How has the information age redefined our life stages from childhood to old age? How do generations communicate across the gulf of change that can so frequently divide? Does our society undervalue the role of caring for children? They are provocative questions. There are a few questions among many others that will be addressed by this session. In introducing the speakers, I not only have to chair the session, I've got the unenviable task of being the timekeeper. Everyone has 10 minutes exactly. They can't take any more than 10 minutes. So at around 8 minutes, contestants, I will be waving my hand frantically, not drowning, but waving. And that's designed to bring your speeches to a close. And then, of course, we'll have a panel session. You never know. You never know. It is quite early in the morning, but things move along quite quickly at this university. We will have a panel session and we'll take your questions from the floor. So let us begin. Introducing Kathy Lett, someone who really doesn't need any introduction. Kathy is, of course, an Australian author, a columnist, a screenwriter. I'm very happy to say she is also a singer in her past life, which certainly wins my admiration. Her novels have been published in 14 languages. She's an ambassador for Women and Children First, Plan International and the White Ribbon Alliance. In 2010, she received an honorary doctorate from Southampton University. She has indeed been a singer with the Salami Sisters, a newspaper columnist in Sydney and New York, and a television sitcom writer for Columbia Pictures in Los Angeles. I think she's part of the psyche of this nation as through her first novel, of course, Puberty Blues, which was such a breakthrough success, and also there was a wonderful film by Bruce Beresford made of that novel. She's published many successful novels since, and her latest novel, The Boy Who Fell to Earth, brings far more than just her trademark humour and wit, drawing on her personal experiences of Asperger's syndrome. It is heartbreaking, it's humble, it's heartwarming, and it's hilarious. Please welcome Kathy Lett. Passion stuff.
What a spunk rat. Oops. Hello. We're going to have girl talk this morning, boys. I hope you're ready. Okay. Kids are like IKEA appliances. You have no idea how much assembly is required until it's way too late, right? I mean, and I love my kids with a primal passion, but there are those days I'm tempted to put them back in the condom vending machine for the refund. I'm so desperate not to have any more children, I've actually put a condom on my vibrator. I mean, it's bad enough when they're babies, but when they're teenagers, I mean, who's got a teenage daughter here in the room? Oh my God, it's like living with the Taliban. You're not allowed to laugh, sing, dance, wear short skirts. You know, when I do wear a short skirt, my daughter's, and I say, aren't my legs okay? Can't I still wear this? She says, it's not the skirt, Mum. You know, it's not your legs, it's just the skirt doesn't go with your face. Ouch. But I have got a fantastic survival tip for any mothers out there. Next time your teenage daughter's hitting you and kicking you and saying, I wish you'd just die, take a big drag on a cigarette, a big gulp of wine and say, I'm doing my best, darling. But by far the worst aspect of parenting is trying to be perfect. It begins when you're pregnant. I mean, there's no word for macho for women, but there should be femcho or something, because that one-woman upmanship starts in the labour ward. This pressure on you to give your child the best start, the most perfect start in life by giving birth naturally. I mean, why? We've done drugs all our lives. Why stop now? I mean, honestly, it is Stone Age what happens to you in that birthing room. It's completely prehistoric. Lying on that birthing table, adoption starts to look like a very attractive alternative. And if ever you're in any doubt about the gender of God, you then know that he is a bloke. And yet, of course, the blokes are no help. My husband didn't want to be there at the birth, and I kept saying, I don't want to be there. You know, if you're there when it went in, you'll be there when it comes out. But of course, being a man, he completely took over. We sat at the birthing class, the little gurus at the front, and she said, and who's having a natural childbirth? And all the men put their hands up. I mean, you know what men are like with pain? They need an epidural to get their ingrown toenail cut. I think actually hypochondria is Greek for man. And any man who said he's not a hypochondriac, that's the only disease he doesn't have, right? So I would say, yes, do have the man there, because it's the one time to get anything you've ever wanted, you know, new car, new carpet, holiday in the Caribbean. They're the pregnancy cravings I got. And also, the only other thing you need to know, it's a bit off topic, but just don't have the enema, because crapping on the obstetrician is the ultimate revenge, yes? Highlight of my life. And when the doctor's doing the episiotomy, just ask him to keep on sewing, because you don't want anything going in there or coming out of there ever again. But all of that is a doddle compared to what comes next. Cracked nipples, you know, constipation, mountains of hemorrhoids. I mean, Edmund Hillary couldn't scale those bastards. But no matter how bad it gets, as the mother, you can't escape because you're tethered by the tit. You know, you're a 24-hour catering service. You are Meals on Heels. Then there's the sleep deprivation, the sex deprivation. Although, as a new mother, do you really ever want to have sex again? I think a new mother's favourite position is the doggy position, where he begs and you just roll over and play dead. Why? Because of, you know, we're exhausted. I mean, even though women make up 50% of the workforce, I would say we're still doing, what do you think, girls? 99% of all the housework and all the childcare. And when a woman comes home from work and, you know, defrosts the chops, puts the washing on, does the ironing, puts the cat out, finds the lost sports kit, finds the square root of the hypotenuse, because that's lost as well, apparently, does all the homework, gets the kids into bed, cleans their teeth, etc. By the time you get into bed, the one thing you're fantasising about is sleep, and then you get the hand, and you think, not the hand. You know, men make horror movies called The Blob and The Thing. Women would make the hand. I mean, here's this guy who hasn't talked to you all day, hasn't helped you around the house. He thinks you're in the mood for love. You're in the mood for running him through with a carving knife. Although I have got a really good sex tip for any mother who wants to get out of having sex with her husband. Just when you feel the prod of his member in your back, you tell him that the tax department rang and want to audit his accounts, because not only does he lose the urge for sex, but he won't be able to sleep, so no snoring either. Results! Anyway, so I think the minimum sort of... Oh, I know what I was going to say. Because the other thing is that, as all mothers know, the Dunkirk evacuation would be easier to organise than a working mother getting her kids up and out of the house in the morning. And I have this fight with my husband all the time, saying, you've got to help me more around the house. And he's like, well, I'd like to, but I'm a man and I can't multitask. Haven't you heard that? Now, what a biological cop-out. Can you imagine any man having any trouble multitasking at, say, an orgy? He would have no trouble at that particular time. So I'm sorry, boys, that doesn't wash. I would also say the minimum hideous habit acceptance ratio is about 100 to 1 in the man's favour. Men pee on the porcelain, you know, they think the toilet fairy changes the roll on the spindle, they think washing up means leaving a pan to soak. What is that? And while we're talking about male inferiority, you know, why is it that you boys would rather die than ask for directions? I mean, what is that? I think that's why they always have a woman on the space shuttle, don't you? I'm sure that's why. And also, what is this thing, this Australian male thing, where you think sex drive means doing it in the car? What is that? Although I might have worked out, you know that why this is? You know that little sign on the rear vision mirror that says, objects in this mirror may appear larger than they are? I think that's why. Yeah. You know, but getting back to domesticity, though, why is it that men think sitting on the toilet is a leisure activity? I mean, that's what they seem to be doing all morning instead of helping in the kitchen. So, anyway, it's impossible to be perfect parent when you're spending all your time parenting your messy husband. I mean, it's particularly difficult for me because I'm married to a human rights lawyer, which means I can never get the high moral ground. You know, whenever I say to... When we had a new baby and I'd say to Jeff, come in here and change this nappy, he'd say, I'd like to, but I'm sorry, but I've got 250 people on death row in Trinidad. What could I say? Although after a year I started saying, oh, let them die. You know, after the second baby I was like, I'm going to go there and kill them myself, you know. Human rights begin at home. Oh, and just a little bit off topic. Guess who Jeff was going out with when I met him? You won't believe it. Nigella. Oh. Yeah, he broke up with her for me, and I can't cook. I use my smoke alarm as a timer. Anyway, the trouble is you can't have a perfect work-life balance when it's still a man's world. It seems to me that any woman who calls herself a post-feminist has kept her wonder bra and burnt her brains. We still don't have equal pay. We're getting 75 cents in the dollar. We're still getting concussion hitting our head on the glass ceiling, and we're supposed to, Windex it while we're up there. And we also have this second glass ceiling at home, which is slowing down our progress. So the truth is, working mums juggle so much we could be in the Moscow State Circus. And the only way to survive is by not trying to be perfect. Perfect mothers only exist in American sitcoms. My 2 top mothering tips, okay, a balanced meal is whatever stays on the spoon on the way to the baby's mouth, and control crying is the art of not shattering into tears when your baby vomits all over your new designer suit, right? Oh, and retrain your hubby domestically to adore you, not bore you, and do all your chores for you. And, over half of all marriages in Australia end in divorce. And for the first time in history, the majority of those divorces are being initiated by women. Because, basically now that women are economically independent and we can impregnate ourselves, if our vibrators could kill spiders in the bathtub, light the barbecue and tell us we don't look fat and stretch lycra, would we need you boys at all? And, it really is in your interest to keep us happy, because we know, I don't know if you've read all these statistics, that married men live longer than single men, have less heart disease and mental problems, whereas single women live longer than married women, have less heart disease and mental problems. So, and it's not as though we're asking for that much. I mean, happy wife equals happy life. All we want you to do, first of all, is cook, because there's nothing sexier than a man doing a few sensitive things with the snow peas in the kitchen. Don't you think, girls? Yes. The way to a woman's heart is through her stomach. That's not aiming too high. And talk to us, because I sometimes feel my small intestine communicates with me more often than my husband. And please understand that the Kama Sutra is not an Indian takeaway, all right? The trouble with married sex is not women faking orgasms, but men faking foreplay, all right? Mutual orgasm is not an insurance company. And the most important thing is to help us a little bit around the house. Because honestly, nowhere in my marriage vows did it state that I would love, hoover and obey. And boys, believe me, it is scientifically proven that no woman ever shot her husband while he was vacuuming. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy Less, and I didn't dare put my hand up to tell you that you had 2 minutes to go. All right, on with the multitasking. I'd now like to introduce Professor Janet McCalman. Janet McCalman is a professor at the Centre for Health and Society, as well as the History and Philosophy program in the Faculty of Arts, University of Melbourne. Professor McCalman has published 3 award-winning books. Her work has included oral history, archival research, qualitative and quantitative analysis. She has also published in labour history, education, politics and social practices. Please welcome Janet McCalman.
Well, now we've got to be serious, I'm sorry. If we're going to talk about families, we need a little bit of big picture stuff. Let's start with the personal, that's what always we're meant to do. Well, I'm a baby boomer, born in 1948, I'm a classic baby boomer. And in my lifetime, there have been more families created on this earth probably than ever before in human history. And that's because there are more people than ever before in human history. When I was born, the world's population was just over 2 billion. It's now 7, and it's going to reach probably 9, if at the worst case scenario, 10. And it's done because we've conquered infant mortality. which has been a great achievement, and it's meant that most babies that are born grow up to have babies, and then they also can grow up expecting to grow old. And this has been the most extraordinary achievement of humanity in the last 200 years. The downside of that is we've had too many babies, because if everyone starts having babies, then they keep on having babies generation after generation. And it's not a question of cutting population, because, you know, these little parties that were in the last election wanting to cut population. If you really want to cut population, you'd have to murder about 3 billion people. And you never see those people ever putting their hand up to be first among the culled. So we've got all these people. But the other great achievement of the last 200 years is for the first time in our history as a species, we've learnt to control our fertility. And so, in fact, the population explosion will not reach 20 billion, which is what it would if it continued exponentially, but we're already heading towards evening off, and that we may actually not make the 10 billion by 2050. But we've added 1 billion in the last 13 years. That's a lot of people. So we've had this extraordinary thing happen with families. And in rich countries, in fact, the reproduction rate is now below what's needed to balance the population. They are running short of people in Europe. Clearly, they need to import people from parts of the world where there are too many people for the jobs available. But they don't really like doing that either. But there have been unintended consequences, because when you start having small families, it makes the whole family smaller. So it means fewer brothers and sisters, fewer uncles and aunts, fewer cousins. And in fact, what we're doing is having a shrinking family. Indeed, with marriages breaking up and people living so long, we've now got more people living alone in a house of their, or flat or apartment or abode of their own than ever before in human history. Now, this has got implications for how we run society and how we manage things. Because we've got, at one hand, my generation, the baby boomers, for whom the welfare state was not costed. The welfare state was costed for the cohort before us. It wasn't costed for following cohorts. And that cohort before us was quite small. So we've got my generation, the young people in the audience, you're going to be keeping us for the next 50 years. And you're going to get smaller and smaller. And you also face the fact that you haven't got any wealth unless your parents are able to do an intergenerational transfer. So if you're under 35 and you're not in that small group of areas in the economy where you make a lot of money on your own, you can't survive unless you have in your household 2 incomes. But we have a large number of families where there's only 1 income. And so it's not possible, in fact, to run a household and provide a roof over the head with 1 income, particularly if that income is on welfare. So we have all these increasing, very small nuclear families. This is not a new problem. In fact, the tradition that we brought with us when Europeans came and took this country from Aboriginal people was an English tradition where nuclear families had been the norm, and where always people have had small families. And that's great for a productive economy, but it's actually very bad for people who don't have a family. Now, it had traditionally been the role of the church to look after people who didn't have a family. But when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, there was nowhere for them to go. So in 1601, with the Elizabethan Poor Law, the English invented the welfare state, paid for by tax, where the parish took on a role of care and parenthood for everyone born within that parish. In 1674, the Act of Settlement gave every English person the legal right to be relieved of poverty. And the parish took over the role of looking after the many children who lost their parents very early in life, a huge number. The idea of families not having 2 parents is a very, very old one, because people used to die. So the parish should look after them. And this is the basis of the welfare state that we've developed. It's really in the form we have now over the 20th century, successive Labor governments bringing in welfare programs. And the role of the welfare state is to enable people without a family to survive. Now think about that. For all the people who don't have a family, who don't have family wealth, and the family traditionally in human societies has been the source of welfare and finance, The welfare state is to enable those without a family to survive, who are getting more and more numerous. Look at all these divorces. We have a new poverty of women who divorce in middle life, don't get much out of this divorce settlement and are homeless by the time they're 65. So we've actually got a very dramatic change happening, and we've got some terribly big challenges ahead, because you've got all my generation who need interest rates to be high, whereas the young people here, you need them to be low. We need property values to keep rising, you need them to fall. We need to be kept, but you need money for your children. You need money to be going into schools. You need money to be going into retraining, particularly into things like TAFE. But no, we're going to need money to be providing us with accommodation and intensive medical care for our last 10 years, when the most expenditure in a whole lifespan is actually made by the health system. So we're going to be running out of money. And we've got this now war between generations where the numbers politically will be stacked in a generation that's trying to hold on to its wealth because it needs to, and a younger generation who are shut out, and yet who face job insecurity, who can't afford a roof over their head. So we're going to have to start talking between generations. So what's my big idea? My big idea is that we take a lesson from the Elizabethan Poor Law, from the parish, which a great deal of detailed historical work, particularly from groups at Cambridge University, has shown worked extremely well until the end of the 18th century. Because it was local, because it was personal, because people accepted a responsibility for each other, that it was part of being a member of a community that you looked out for one another. Perhaps we need to recreate at a local level civic families. And maybe we baby boomers retiring are going to have to do, dare I say it, work for the pension. We have huge amount of skills. There are thousands of people with nursing qualifications who could be community nurses. There are thousands of people who've got tremendous life skills who could be surrogate grandparents, friends, carers, child carers. Young families can't afford childcare, but there are going to be all these people now living off the taxpayer, because 80% of people now who are retired take the old age pension. So if we're going to have the young work for the dole, maybe the aged should work for the pension. And this could be a way that they enhance their income and contribute to society, and we can start to build again villages within our cities where people care for each other. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Janet. Working for the pension. I can feel when we get to the voting session, the votes kind of coming in thick and strong for that proposition. No, it's a really provocative and wonderful concept. People have been so good sticking to the time limit. I'm sure Dr. Simon Crouch will be no exception. Simon is a public health doctor and researcher at the Mackay Vic Health Centre for Community Wellbeing at the University of Melbourne. Simon has worked on both health policies and health programs as a medical officer with the Australian Government Department of Health and Ageing. He is the lead investigator of the Australian study of child health in same-sex families, a large-scale study which collected data on 500 children nationally up to the age of 17. Please welcome Dr. Simon Crouch.
That's the wrong way. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a same-sex attracted parent? Probably not. Well, I thought I'd give you a bit of a flavour of some of the questions that I get asked as a same-sex parent today. And for this, I'm going to invite my wonderful assistant, Kirsty, up onto the stage to give me a hand. So, round of applause for Kirsty. So we're going to reenact a conversation that I had in the park recently with a parent. Neither of us are actors. We won't be winning any Logies. So bear with us, and hopefully it'll give you the idea.
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Are they your kids? Are you babysitting?
No, I'm not babysitting. I actually look after them pretty much all of the time.
Oh, so your wife works then?
Actually, no, I don't have a wife. The boys, they don't have a mother. They have two dads.
Oh. So they're adopted then?
No, actually, we're not allowed to adopt in Victoria. They were born through surrogacy.
Oh, Oh, wow, well, that's great. So did they see their mum much then?
No, they don't have a mum, they have a surrogate. And no, she lives in America. We actually were on holiday there earlier this year and caught up with her. It was great, it was lovely.
Oh, nice. Do they look like her mum?
No, she's a surrogate. And no, there was a separate egg donor. She's anonymous, and we don't have any contact with her.
Oh, right. So who's the dad?
We're both the dad. There's two of us. Yeah.
No, I meant who's the biological dad?
Okay, so the egg donor, she provided the eggs. I fertilised some, my partner fertilised some, and we put some of each into the surrogate, and this is what we got.
Wow.
Yeah.
So clever. Are you married?
No, we had a civil partnership in the UK, but when we came to Australia, it's not recognised here, so that's just the way it is.
Gosh. Oh, so great. Oh, with the kids and everything. Good on you. It's really good. Fantastic.
And with that slightly patronising comment, the conversation usually goes off in a different direction. Can you thank Kirsty for me? Now, at this point in the conversation, I really want to turn around and say something like, so tell me, what position were you and your husband in when you conceived your first child? I don't, and you might think that's somewhat of a personal question, but actually, if you think about the questions I've just been asked, a lot of those are quite personal. Now, I don't mind answering them because I see that it is my role to lead by example and to educate people about same-sex families. But there are a number of underlying assumptions in the conversation you just heard, and I thought I might pick up on one or two of them. First of all, there are those clear gender stereotypes that mum stays at home and looks after the kids, dad goes out to work and earns the money and only babysits the children when mum's busy. Now, we know that in Australia this is changing, and the previous two talks have demonstrated that. But even for the most liberal-minded of us, when it comes down to it, it's really hard to let go of that gender-based assumption about families. One of the other things that often surprises me is the fact that people in Victoria specifically don't realise that same-sex attracted people cannot adopt. A number of states and territories across Australia have moved to change this, but as things stand in Victoria, except in very rare and complicated circumstances, same-sex attracted people are not allowed to adopt children. We're going to come back to that a little bit later on in the talk, but I thought I'd put it out there early on for you to think about. I'm also surprised that people don't seem to have a lot of understanding about surrogacy, and in particular the concept that my children don't have a mother. They have two dads, there's a donor and a surrogate, not a surro mum, not a donor mum. They have two dads and two really lovely ladies who are able to help us to have children. My kids know that. If you were to ask them, they'll tell you they don't have a mum. They'll tell you they don't want to have a mum. Now, I don't blame people for having this idea. That ideal of motherhood is put out there in society all over the place. We see it in kids' storybooks, it's on television, it's in films, it's taught at primary school, at kindergarten. So really, when it comes down to it, that ideal of motherhood is there for everyone to see, and it's really difficult for people to let go of, even though my lived experience is very different. When I have these sorts of conversations, they almost inevitably end up talking about marriage equality, and I'm sure you're not surprised about that. And in society today, marriage equality is something that has a lot of resonance, and we talk about it quite a lot. Now, in Melbourne, we tend to get quite a positive response. People tend to say quite positive things, but that's not always the case. And all too often, my family has to hear negative rhetoric in this context. You know the sort of thing. Marriage is between a man and a woman. Marriage is so that we can have children. Children need both a mother and a father so that they can thrive in society. Well, that's actually not true, and what my research here at the University of Melbourne is showing is that, in fact, children with same-sex attracted parents score just as well on most measures of health and well-being when they're compared to the average Australian child. And you know what? They actually score significantly better on measures of general health, general behaviour, and family cohesion. This is great, but it's not all a bed of roses. What we find is that same-sex families actually do encounter discrimination, and when they do, it is children that are often affected. Now, this discrimination can come in many forms. It can be quite blatant. It can be a child that is excluded from a religious school because of their parents' chosen lifestyle. But it can also be much more subtle. It can be a letter sent home from school that's addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs, when in fact for same-sex families that's not appropriate. And despite the school being told time and again that it's not appropriate, it carries on happening, and this can be very wearing on the family. Now, much of the discrimination that there is in society can be tackled at a governmental level. Because today in Australia, there are still many legislated aspects of discrimination in our society. If we take the Marriage Act, for example, the Marriage Act states that marriage is between a man and a woman. Well, what does that say to same-sex families? It says that heterosexual relationships are the norm. This is what we want in our society. Same-sex families are different. It gives that message to society in general and tells everybody in the population it's okay to treat same-sex families differently. It's okay to treat them as somehow lesser. This is seen also in the adoption laws I mentioned earlier. When we look at the adoption laws in Victoria that say heterosexual people are the people we want to have raising children, we don't want same-sex people raising children, they don't do such a good job. Well, we know that's not true. And again, it sends that message of discrimination and exclusion to same-sex families. The third and final area of discrimination that's legislated in Australia that I wanted to touch on today is in the anti-discrimination laws themselves. Australia has some great anti-discrimination laws at both state and federal level, but almost universally, these laws have exemptions for religious organisations. Now, that might be okay in some contexts, but I just want you to think about for a moment the fact that many of our religious organisations provide essential services such as healthcare and education, and these services are publicly funded. Yet these religious organisations are allowed to willfully discriminate against same-sex parent families, and this leaves thousands of families in Australia in a constant state of insecurity. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to carry on having conversations like the one you heard before, and I'm going to take my role of leading by example. But I put it to you that today in Australia, all jurisdictions should immediately remove any legislated discrimination that discriminates against same-sex parent families. Come on, Australia, it's time that we all lead by example. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, very much indeed. It's now time, if I could ask our wonderful speakers to come up here and form the beginnings of a panel, and we're delighted also to welcome two other people to our panel who will take questions. If I can introduce Anne Mann. Anne, are you here? Would you like to come up? Anne, of course, is a Melbourne writer and essayist, social philosopher, and has regular columns with The Australian, The Age, and The Monthly, has published several books, and it's wonderful of you to join us today, Anne. Thank you very much. And also Hutch Hussain, if you could join us, please. Hutch is the Senior Manager of Refugees, Immigration and Multiculturalism at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and the University of Melbourne and the Brotherhood of St Lawrence enjoy a very good, very collaborative relationship based on research. Over the past 14 years, Hutch has worked with at-risk young people, family violence victims, and in the field of adult mental health and settlement of newly arrived refugees. She is a recipient of the Vincent Fairfax Ethics in Leadership Fellowship. So welcome all. So I think it's at this point we open the floor up for questions and also to our Twitter feed. Do we have any Twitters that we'd like to start with? Tweets that we'd like to start with? Oh yes, house rules. Please, when you ask your question, just wait for the microphone, which we'll deliver as expeditiously as possible. Thank you, Rashada.
Brilliant. So this seems to be directed to Janet McCalman. This is more of a comment, but I'll phrase it as a question. Is it true that the aged should be entitled to work-free retirement, and that the answer is actually childcare and partners' help for women in the workforce?
True.
That the age should be entitled to work-free retirement.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's clearly one of the ways we manage the ageing population is to enable people to keep working longer. But, of course, that keeps jobs out of the hands of young people who need them. So it's a trade-off. So maybe we need a different type of work for older people. And there are ways in which often people who are retired, it's an opportunity for them to do things quite different from what they did in their working life. I'm thinking of a family friend who had been a fitter and turner all his life, in retirement became a social worker. So I think it's a chance for people, and this is where TAFE can be so important, and university. I think university is often wasted on young people. I think it'd be much better to have all mature age students.
I'd like to come. Can I just add something to that, though? And also, surely, when you keep working, it keeps you mentally agile and keeps you alive much longer. So it makes great sense.
Questions? Fiona? Microphone?
Fantastic session, and raised lots of issues that I think are really important as propositions, and can't wait to vote. One of the people I wanted to have at this session was Anne-Marie Slaughter, whom you may have read about, her article in the Atlantic Monthly where she said women can't have it all, and she was slaughtered by some of the rigid feminists, but she wrote a very good article about the workplace and how the workplace needs to change. So I guess my question really is to Anne, Janet and Kathy. None of you really mentioned how the workplace can be so damaging. Well, Kathy, you did in the funniest way, but really, we have do we have an uncaring workforce, and what are the kinds of things we can do to make that workforce, instead of banging our head and Windexing the glass ceiling, Kathy, which I thought was a great image, what can we do to make it more understanding of our roles, as both for men and women, in terms of our roles, caring roles?
I'd quite like to draw on both Kathy's sparkling address, but also what Janet was saying, and just step back a little bit and say that the pressure to be perfect and to cope with too much was really what Anne-Marie Slaughter was saying, and Kathy told us with wit, but that was really the issue. And if you think about what Janet is saying, she's essentially saying there isn't enough money. So I want to actually put those two problems together and say that, in essence, there's a whole trope of writing about motherhood and not about parenthood, because so much has been loaded onto to women, but in particular societies. And those societies are especially the UK, America, and the US and Australia. And all of those societies, to lesser and greater degrees, are neoliberal societies. That is, we've been pushing towards a smaller state, less state expenditure. All of you will have heard of the economic rationalism, as we call it here in Australia, but essentially a much more pro-business regime. But in essence, there has been a reduction in the amount of tax that we take, so there is less tax available for actually what needs to be an entirely new, I don't know if people in the audience know this phrase, Janet will, the Australian settlement. There used to be an old Australian settlement with the breadwinner male and the wife at home, and you had to have a certain kind of wage which would provide for that. And there was a certain sort of set of regulations to do with the working man and what he needed. And actually what we are now doing is undergoing an extraordinary social revolution with women not only entering but remaining in the workforce, and yet we are merely tinkering at the edges, and in the workplace really lives with the old Australian settlement by and large. That is, it is saying, if you go to every workplace, here's a simple example, we're at a university, young academic women are advised by older academics to write a whole lot of articles before they have children, and then as they go through maternity leave and then sort of cut back to part-time, they can release these articles as if they have never had a baby. So there's something fundamentally wrong with that picture, and if we want to have an answer to some of the economic problems that Janet McCallum was talking about, of having this huge cohort of baby boomers and women in the workforce, we actually have to do a hell of a lot more than provide 26 weeks of parental leave, which leaves the rest of the period of about 20 years when children are dependent. So there's this, what there is in essence is the expectation that women will go into the workforce, but there are very small modifications. It's what I call not the road to emancipation, but the road to exhaustion.
Thank you.
I think it's a bit more complicated than that, and I would like to qualify the Australian settlement because it left out two key parts of the population. The unskilled, who were caught in the casual economy, and we're now returning to having a large proportion of our people in a casual economy where they have no way they can really imagine the future. So that wasn't resolved until World War II. So a very large, and the other group, of course, were Aboriginal Australians, who were entirely outside the Australian settlement. And the consequences on both those groups of the population, which were very large in terms of the people in the casual economy, were dire. So I think we had a short period in the 1950s and 1960s. And the key thing is, in fact, which no one wants to talk about it because it really is the elephant in the Australian living room, which is the cost of that living room. And that the cost of property in this country, which has been the easy way that people have always made their money from the time that they took the land, has been getting hold of land and keeping it and watching it go up in value, is what goes right through our economy. It increases all our costs. It's not wages and high wages that increase the cost, it's rent. It's the cost of property. And the fact that women and men are working too hard to be able to be parents, and this applies almost as much to men as it does to women. They're travelling too far because they have to live in places far from their work, so they're spending 2 to 3 hours commuting. All of these things are going round about what's happening with housing. And the fact that our private market does not meet the needs of our people, and you can't have a house without 2 incomes. And that's been the killer, both here in the United States and in the UK, in terms of forcing women into the workforce for more than they should be, forcing men to work longer than they should, forcing people to have 2 jobs, and then the middle class commits the further idiocy of thinking they've got to have private education. And so your people are loading themselves with a huge amount of costs which impact very badly on their way of life and increase inequality. We've got to address affordable social housing very seriously in this country. We have probably now 250,000 people on waiting lists for public housing across the nation, and we have state governments, certainly here and in Queensland, who are seriously now talking about privatising the public sector. So look, this is where the crisis is. It's housing, and the second one in the workplace, it's going to be unions who protect workers' rights and protect people's control over their working life.
More questions up the back there. Simon, with Anne-Marie Slaughter in mind, can you have it all?
Can I who? I think it's really actually interesting what's raised here, and whilst acknowledging some of the issues that women have in the workplace, men who want to be fathers have the opposite problem. The workplaces don't acknowledge that men want to be fathers, and I tried to get a part-time job, and it just wasn't acceptable. You know, I'm a man, I should be working hard, and my partner does work and is in that setting, and he's expected to do long hours and doesn't have the flexibility to help out at home in the same way that I'm sure many husbands have the same way. So perhaps workplaces need to reflect family life in general a little bit better and accept that all parents have roles at home.
And do you resent it when you get the hand?
I don't remember the last hand.
All right, I'm sorry. Question up the back, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm perhaps delighted and thank Cathy. I guess as a university student, I guess many students love your kind of presentation. It's full of perhaps symptoms of familial structure restructuring and the role of women's independence and autonomy. At the same time, I think Professor McCommon, as you mentioned, is a student who did anthropology and psychology and history. I mean, sometimes I often compare things diachronically and transnationally. So you mentioned the abolishment of monastic accommodation for people who are less perhaps economic viable. To me...
Excuse me, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but are we coming to a question here?
Well, certainly. So,
yeah, thank you.
So what's happening in the Nordic countries is that people have an obligation to look after those people who are less perhaps economically viable. And here we are here in Australia, and a lot of those assistance it's an act of philanthropy.
So the question, I'm sorry, I'll have to ask you to get to your question because there are other people.
How could we perhaps enhance those people who are less economically viable, enhance their autonomy? And that's my question.
Okay, thank you. Would you like? Yes, thank you, Joan.
I think many people here think fondly of the Nordic countries and wish we could be like them. And certainly my Nordic friends look at us, and I had a colleague staying with us for a year, and he was astounded by Australians' attitude towards the public sphere, towards taxation, towards the sense of investing in each other. But those countries are a product of their own history, which is different from ours. It's very much based on a very strong nationalism, which has quite a strong tone of racism in it. And so when you may be a Swedish citizen but don't look Swedish, life's very hard. And so it doesn't apply when they start going outside the national family. I'm talking about us recovering part of our English heritage, because we've now got a government that's very anxious that we should be bringing all of this back into our school. All right, Christopher Pine, here it is. The welfare state is part of our English DNA as much as the common law and Magna Carta. And I'm saying that this is something in a welfare state which is run, particularly at a local level, is one in which we observe and institutionalise and have institutionalised fairness, which is really what the left has always been about in this country. And so if you do that, you're starting to build a society which has got some resilience, because at the moment we're turning into a more and more atomised society where people are more and more vulnerable.
Yeah, lovely.
Thank you. Very happy to see lots of hands going up. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Simon, really enjoyed your comments on marriage equality and support the role of fathers and all sorts of family. Kathy, your comments, humorous, tongue-in-cheek, I suspect to a large extent, because my question's about parental equality and whether the kind of cultural messages coming from, feminist speakers as well as from people looking at same-sex issues and across the board, whether the cultural and legal support, encouragement for fathers can actually be front and centre as well, because I think it serves both genders and both groups of parents really well.
I'll take that as a comment, unless someone would like to...
Well, I can speak to it a little bit, and it's a really important point. And I mentioned in my talk that in some areas kids with same-sex parents are doing better than the average Australian child. And the reason for this is it actually comes through parental equality. And in fact, same-sex parents set up their family life in a much more equal way, generally speaking, because they aren't constrained by those gender roles. They go to work if that's the thing that suits them best. They stay at home if that's the thing that suits them best. They tend to work part-time, both a little bit. And this really breaks down a lot of the barriers within the family and allows that family cohesion to really meld and really promotes communication. So that equality that is sort of inbuilt in same-sex families is one of the things that's doing the kids a great deal of good.
Yeah, and I was going to say, when we were talking about how my generation thought we were going to have it all, but we just ended up doing it all, is in the heterosexual world, I mean, this is backed up by research, that the second glass ceiling I'm talking about that women face at home is that, in the recent research done in Britain anyway, if a child is ill, 43% of mothers said they would just take the time off without, that would be their responsibility. They said only 3% of men said they would do that. So even though women and men have equal jobs, it's the women who's still taking on this burden at home. And of course, in the workforce, we're hemorrhaging talent. I mean, in the women in their 20s and 30s are excelling at work, and then when the whole motherhood thing happens, they get out of the workforce, they can't come back in at the right level, childcare's a constant hassle. And I don't know if you had all this research here this week, but in Britain, the new research also shows that in companies where women are in positions of power, or on companies where women are on boards, those companies are doing much better. This is new research, I hadn't read that before. So it's vital that we keep women who want to work in the workforce, but we have to address the childcare issue. And feminists have been going on about this for decades, and nothing's really changed. So to me, that's the really big issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Cathy. Yes?
Thank you.
You have the microphone.
Okay, I have a question here for Hutch, actually. So far we've been talking about a lot of the pressures on families in heterosexual families and same-sex attractive families who do at least have some of the benefits associated with citizenship in this country. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on perhaps how our asylum seeker policies that are so narrowly focused on stopping the boats affect families of a refugee background, asylum seeker background, and the kind of pressures that they're facing now.
Thanks for your question. We work with a lot of refugee families at the Brotherhood and are seeing some of the effect of the current policies, but for those who do get permanent residency, they're really kind of struggling with that transition of not only moving to a new country, but often what we see is intergenerational conflict with their kids who are juggling the two worlds. And some of you may have experienced this from being migrant families, where there's a real juggling of the values that they're trying to hold as parents and wanting to instill in their kids, and then seeing their kids really wanting to adjust to, and because the kids integrate much quicker, the way they pick up language much quicker, they adjust to the values much quicker. So we start to see conflict when people look at whether it's going out and breaking curfews or intermarrying, all those kind of issues kind of come up. So it's a real struggle for parents on that regard. In terms of the asylum seeker that we work with, often it's the father who's kind of come out because and the plan was to reunite with their family. And what we're going to see under the coalition government is that people are not going to be put onto TPVs, temporary protection visas, and are not going to be able to reunite with their families. And ironically, what that's going to mean is that people are actually going to risk their lives and take boats, get on a boat and try to reunite with their family. And so that's one of the unintended consequences I think we'll see. And we saw it under the Howard government. People actually did try to join their families because that family reunion wasn't possible.
Thank you, Hutch. Next question, please.
There are two things that haven't been mentioned so far and that are affecting families, young people, older people, everybody. One is the increased casualisation of the workforce in Australia, and there are a whole lot of reasons for that, and bad reasons too, and discrimination is one of them. And the other is the distortion of the housing market by negative gearing, which costs taxpayer billions of dollars a year that could go towards helping people who actually need a rung on the housing ladder, etc.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel like to... do we have an expert on negative gearing in particular?
No. I mean, negative gearing would be one of the most important reforms to try and reduce the cost of housing. But of course, you've got this generational conflict, and that's, any party that put that forward is going to be voted out by the baby boomers.
I know, but two big parties don't touch it.
Well, they can't. You see, and the Greens are never going to be elected, so it's irrelevant. And so this is what I mean about we need a different national conversation about intergenerational responsibility, but people are going to hang on to their wealth, and they do so, and they always have, and they're going to be extremely selfish. But the thing is that they're going to run out of money. Even people on defined benefit pensions are going to run out of money in the next 40 years. It's not going to last. So we're facing, the baby boomers, poverty in our 80s. And if we're sensible, we'll start preparing for that now, because we cannot do that and save ourselves at the expense of the young, because at the moment, that's what's happening.
There are also poor baby boomers too.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So the poor baby, particularly with marriage breakdown, it's left both parties without a home. And so there's the new homelessness. I'd sometimes think that all the tiny little flats that the University of Melbourne has encouraged building for international students, when they stop coming, because they'll all be doing online courses, we'll be able to put homeless baby boomers in them.
I think we now have a fourth proposition to vote on. When we get to it, we've got a number of questions. I'll try and get to them. The gentleman in the black jumper there with the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks for a fabulous session. Just on this childcare question that Kathy was talking about before, and Janet, you talked about the need for perhaps older people to start working for the dole, and it strikes me that childcare is one of those areas. But how do you promote that at the same time as protecting the professionalism of the childcare workers who are also dependent? How do you deal with that contradiction?
Well, the point is that the need far exceeds the delivery of people doing that work. And we'll see what happens to childcare workers. I mean, one of the achievements of the Gillard government was to raise their wages and also to start raising their qualifications. But I think there's a lot of home care and support that can be done. So you may not use... I want to see kids in kindergarten again. Kindergarten is crucial. We don't have a kindergarten movement that slots in an hour of school preparation into a childcare centre. That's not kinder. Maybe this sort of childcare is the sort that's at home in your house. It's sort of like a nanny, but not. And I think one of the things we've got to do is start tapping into the experience of older people. You know, there've been, particularly very older people now, I mean, the people who are my parents' generation raised the healthiest generation of children in history. They really did. They had all their children immunised for a start. And they took notice of what the doctor said. And they fed their children very healthily, and they didn't let them eat between meals. And they insisted on a certain amount of discipline. And we have, you know, we bear the benefits of that as a very healthy generation. But seriously, there are, you know, I think huge resources of wisdom, knowledge, skill, and even in my own work in history, doing crowdsourcing with retired people and as research has been absolutely stunning experience.
We are actually already utilising baby boomer labour as grandparents, and they are actually the largest source of childcare, particularly for the under-twos. In New South Wales, for example, they save the federal government $90 million a year, and that's in New South Wales alone. So there is a way in which I think that working for the dole had a really punitive and cruel edge to it, and I would be extremely worried about pitting generations against each other, such that, you know, for example, if it's working for the pension, at what age does it cut off? Does my mother, who is presently walking along with a walker and has early dementia, does it apply to her? I mean, I assume that there would be a cut-off, but I would rather see ways of encouraging, getting rid of ageism, encouraging baby boomers to work longer, but also to recognise the enormous, which is a very good point that Janet is making, it's what I call the shadow care economy, and to encourage people, but also to give them the respect that is due to all the forms of care that actually underpin the entire economy. So that, you know, I think one of the things that Simon has been addressing in the question over here is to do with men and care. And so Kathy was giving a very funny version of it, but there's a sober and difficult side to it, which is that men are often, you know, I'll just give an example of a quote. I came in a book on American families, and the grandfather was in his 60s and he'd given up work, and he said, I spend my life looking after my elderly mother, helping out with the grandkids and doing these things, but I'm no longer in the workforce and I feel I have failed as a man. Right. So that, you know, the other side of that is that there's tremendous pressure, and our society is actually very harsh on men who do not do well in the workplace. And any man who wants to take on a caring role and be a really involved father, for example, will cop the prejudice. But coming back to the idea of enlisting, I'm all for enlisting the older generation who are in better health, they have good resources and life skills and so on, but they do need to be motivated to care for children, because one of the reasons why I think that we might be striking this very good evidence on gay families is that you have two, and even under the pressure of the weight of social disapproval, there is this motivation, effort, involvement, and you've got two involved parents. You know, how good is that? Someone said once, "We'd be great if we had three parents."
Yeah. A lot of same-sex families do have three parents.
Well,
different story.
But that's the thing, you know, you need, so in terms of having the older generations, rather than this extremely peculiar idea of, say, retiring at 55 and then not being engaged and living a very selfish and individualistic kind of lifestyle, then I think it's a terrific idea to think about all of us as being not independent or dependent, but interdependent, and thinking of roles of care in terms of honour and in terms of you know, what we can do for one another. But not dragging reluctant, you know, angry. I mean, it's funny that we've thought about mothers and whether or not they really wish to be involved in full-time childcare, but perhaps we don't always look at whether grandmothers wish to be full-time childcarers, or whether, you know, so it has to be something that you want to do.
I was just going to add to that the there was a problem with the divorce rates being so high. And the two peak times for divorce are when the last child finishes school and when the husband retires. Because don't forget, marriages last so long now. I mean, from honeymoon to tomb can be, I don't know what, 80 years now. So, and because men do get a lot of their self-worth through their job, whereas I think women get our self-worth through our friends and through the children. We're sort of more broad in that regard. So when a man retires, I think that also they can tend to atrophy then, because they've lost their sort of self-esteem. And also their testosterone's going down and their estrogen's coming up, so they want to just vegetate. Whereas for the woman, post-menopause, you know, your estrogen's down and your testosterone's up and you want to go out and conquer the world. But it's a really interesting kind of new phenomenon, this, because we are living so long. So I think we have to somehow, yes, encourage men to not just think their only worth is their job and that's how we judge them. Yeah.
But this has been the thing about what being a man has meant, is that you were there to provide. And when men can't provide, because the economy's got no place for them, they've only got their strength to sell, and that's not valued anymore, or they've got limited skills, and that's a huge number of people, then they are failed. And we've always had this, and we tend to forget we're talking about families, we're still thinking about two parents, usually, of course, the same sex. Let's talk about households, and whether households can be, it doesn't matter how they're composed, it's whether they function well and whether they've got enough for shelter and enough for food and enough to nurture children. And we start thinking about households and their community supports, we're on a firmer basis. But you know, what we actually do with older people is going to be one of the really biggest questions we've got to face.
Okay, we've got to take some more questions. You've been very patient, madam, in the elegant blue jacket.
I'm a baby boomer who's still working professionally, and my colleagues are contributing enormously in volunteer work, in caring for grandchildren. They're not actually part of the GDP. They should be. They should be able to put on the census that they're not retired, that they're actually carrying out many hours of unpaid work. They run the communities. If you look at the community centres they're about, you'll find that most people there are retired, who run our local community centres. I think we're being overly pessimistic about the effect of having a larger cohort of older persons. 22% of those older persons are in the range of people who will find it difficult to continue with their finances to the end of their lifetime. They are poor already, but the majority of people over 60 hold the majority of wealth in the country. That's right. So I think we should be looking at supporting housing where families can live independently but close to the older members of the family. I think it'd be fabulous if you look at some of the local housing we've got now, where people have set up privately shared housing amongst groups who are in similar age groups with children, but do that with the grandparents as part of it, for example, you know, and let them put their funds into that.
Yes, no, I'm doing that with my own children. We're setting up a three household family.
Thank you very much. We'll have the woman in the dark jacket here. Yes, but first let's, and then there were some hands going up there. A man right at the back in the blue shirt and a woman with the grey scarf, so our microphone people can get ahead of the game. But let's take a tweet first from Rashada. Oh, we need a microphone down here. We'll come back to you.
So this question is for Hutch again. Can we learn something from Australia's newer families? I assume this means sort of asylum seekers, refugees as well. How do they construct things within our history and our assumptions on roles, being gender roles or parental roles?
Good question.
Just to quickly comment on one of the things that our refugee families often struggle with is the fact that there are fences between their houses, and that was one of the real shocks and that surprises family around really segregating communities when they're used to living in really communal areas. So that kind of reminded me of that. In terms of the question, in terms around gender roles, it's a real big struggle. One of the two big things that often a lot of the men in a different way kind of struggle with our clients is around child protection. So the notion that the state has a role in how they would discipline their kids is a big kind of shock. The second is around family violence, so that notion that, again, the state can intervene in terms of what happens and how things get sorted out with the family. And then the third is that notion that child support gets paid into the mother's bank account. So a real kind of questioning around their authority around those kind of family roles. So I guess that's some of the challenges. On the flip side, there's a real sense of trying to work out things within the family. And so there's often people are coming from communities where there aren't government services or funded services to be able to help. So that's often difficult in terms of getting people to be able to seek help from whether it's family relationship centres or the like. But often the community does come together really well and be able to support each other to be able to work things out on a community level. So that's one of the real, I think, the benefits that refugee families in particular teach us around supporting each other, and things don't need to kind of stay solely within the singular unit, but really that collective family, and whether that's a kind of community mediation or community leaders being drawn into that, and being able to really resolve things without needing to go to external authorities, but really making sure that we utilise that knowledge and look to the elders in the community.
I think I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit in the context of same-sex families. In some ways, you'd be surprised there are some parallels there, that same-sex families have really grown up without extended families for support in the same way, often through discrimination, being ostracised from their family. And so they have this more broader social concept of family as well, where very, very close friends have a very integral role in the family and the family life. And so in a similar way, there is that community-type family-level support going on, which is great.
Act so significantly on families have been well described. And given that parenting is one of the most responsible and important roles in raising our families, we're really helping to create the future. Why is it, do you think, that parents or young people are given absolutely no preparation for that role? I mean, whatever else we do in society, we're trained or educated for it. And I'm thinking of an an in one of the daily papers describing the spokesperson for an agency caring for children who were still living with their families, but were on the cusp of becoming criminals. And she was quoted as saying, it isn't as if they don't love their children, and she was talking about the parents, but no one has taught them how to be a parent. Would the panel like to comment on that?
Well, I think that it's extremely important to, taking up your point that they love their children, but there's something going seriously wrong with their parenting. And perhaps this relates a little bit to Kathy's point about being the perfect parent, that I think if we shift a little bit from the identity of being a good parent or the perfect parent, seeing it as yourself as an individual, and rather help people to see that you are involved in a relationship, and then that child comes more into focus. And so we should be doing everything we can to be supporting and, where necessary, intervening with necessary supports where families are really vulnerable and going off the rails. And we don't do nearly enough of it. We have too many ambulances in the form of too few child protection workers at the bottom of the cliff, and too little before they ever get to that point. An essay I wrote a little while ago about a child who was starved and neglected to the point where she died of starvation and thirst in New South Wales. In that case, the story itself was agonising enough. She died as a 6-year-old, a little thing about this long, and she was completely skeletal. She had no colour in her lungs because she had been boarded up in a room and had not seen sunlight in over 2 years, and the parents had successively withdrawn care from her. But the other agonising part of the story was that you could see multiple points where people could have helped, where neighbours had seen the house full of, kind of knee-deep in rubbish, which is a sure sign that things are really, we won't talk about my housekeeping, but this was, seriously, people were not coping. Both parents were drug addicts and so on. And all of you will read in the paper all the time about child protection cases where they have not had enough workers and so on. But that's what we're not doing. I'm sure Dorothy Scott could perhaps speak a little bit about this later today. But we are not having enough supports, whether it's in the form of childcare help of a really specialised kind to help those families, and we're not doing anything about the approach to the cliff face, and we all just sit around wringing our hands when we realise that there wasn't an ambulance in the form of a child protection worker in this particular terrible case.
That's obviously an incredibly extreme, terrible story, but talking about something that's not so extreme, I do think when you're pregnant you get so much information on eat your folic acid, do this, do that, but you don't get any information about what it's like to actually be a parent. There is no owner's manual. And I think it'd be a really good idea at schools if there could be some kind of parenthood simulator where, you got woken up, they're woken up every hour and covered in vomit and you only use monosyllabic words for 10 hours a day. Just so that girls especially could see it's not a romantic thing having a baby when they're young, whatever. It's really, really hard. It's the hardest job of your life. And if there was more realistic information, it would be a contraceptive, I think, and then we wouldn't have people just having babies.
We actually did a randomised trial of that and it didn't work.
It didn't work.
No.
I'm going to have to. I'm going to squeeze in one more question because the gentleman up there has had a microphone for a long time, but I'm actually under instructions to take no more, so I am risking the wrath of my colleagues here. So if you could be quick, I would be grateful.
Yes, it's a quick question. Is there any good recent research on how children in non-monogamous and community parenting model situations are faring relative to the general community of children population?
Simon, do you have anything?
Specifically related to that, I'm not sure. What tends to happen when you look at research in the area of same-sex families, people try and take the less typical type of families to be the example of same-sex families, and you see single-parent same-sex families, and we know that the outcomes in those contexts are not the same when you have two parents. So I think generally the research suggests that two committed parents, as we've said before, are the best thing you can have, where we can share resources, share the childcare, and that's the best outcome for children. But specifically relating to your question, I don't know of any specific research.
All right, thank you. I'll just have to move things along. As you know, the Festival of Ideas, Fiona Stanley was very keen that it's a deliberative festival, that we actually take action points forward in order to advocate them and hopefully prosecute them. So I think we have 3 formal propositions. If you'd all get out your mobile phones, there's a telephone number there, 0429 883 481, and I'll read out the propositions for those people who wish to vote from outside the auditorium. First, mums need to stop trying to be perfect parents, and it's not possible while dads refuse to help. 2, as families and households shrink and the need of the ageing overwhelm the resources of the young, we need to harness the capacities and experience of those who are fit and retired to build civic families and resilient local communities. And 3, all jurisdictions in Australia should immediately act to remove any remaining legislation that discriminates against same-sex parent families. And remember, this isn't a popularity contest, it is what you want to give highest priority to going forward with those 3 propositions. If you'd like to help the person on your right, that would be good, or left.
Put your hand up if you do need help, you can come and put your hand.
You can only vote once, that's the trouble.
Yes, you can only vote once. Is that right?
Yeah.
No, there's no gaming the system. It's like university rankings.
You can't vote on each proposition.
No.
Oh, can't you just do a hand count? Let's go back to low tech. Yeah.
We like showing off the technology.
Oh, nobody's voting for me. Hello? They're
It's
just your
closed.
hands, yeah.
All right. Well, there we have the results of the response to propositions.
Still going, still going.
It's still going.
You've got more.
Oh, Kathy, you know, Kathy's making a late charge.
Oh, thank God. Otherwise, my self-esteem will be lower than Lady Gaga's bikini line. It's quite low. Yeah. I actually love
While we're waiting for the trends to conclude, I'd just like to thank our panellists and thank our speakers. I think it's been a really substantial session, and apologise to all the people we couldn't get to in questions. Thank you also to our audience for being here and supporting the festival. Thank you all very much.